So now we're going to take a look at the 15th President of the United States, James Buchanan. Again, we have a rubric that we look at as a guidepost just to make sure we hit all the key points when we're covering presidencies. 5 criteria: growth, finances, international politics, war and security, and to leave the country better or worse. For Buchanan, I'm going to use this, but I think there are some major overarching things that are like elephants in the room when you're talking about Buchanan. And probably the biggest one was the Dred Scott decision. You wouldn't say normally that a Supreme Court decision falls to the president. A lot of times the people who are on the Supreme Court prior are the ones making the decisions are appointed by other people. And that's one of the reasons I took a shot at Jackson for picking Taney. Um, but in this instance, in Buchanan's inaugural address, he more or less made clear that he had been talking to the Supreme Court. He kind of knew what the decision was, and he thought it was going to solve everything. And there's a lot of information we have now that he was working behind the scenes to try to, lobby Supreme Court justices to go along with the decision, so it would seem like it was a more overwhelming decision, and to expand it, and a lot of this was seen as untoward, and some Supreme Court justices resigned over it. So I think it's fair to put a lot of that on Buchanan because it seemed like he legitimately thought he was going to be able to solve the slavery crisis with the Dred Scott decision when in fact he just poured gasoline on the fire. It was a horrible Supreme Court decision. Again, probably one of the worst, if not the worst. The only reason I don't say it is the worst is there are so many bad Supreme Court decisions. Maybe there's one worse. I can't think of one. Closest I can think of off the top of my head right now is Cruikshank, but even that I don't think was worse. It basically destroyed any of the states' rights arguments you might make about the Civil War. You basically had with this decision saying to the northern states, we don't care what you want. We don't care if you don't want slavery. You have to accept slavery in your territories, at least as if people come here to escape, you have to send them back to the fugitive slave laws. And quite frankly, the way it was written and worded, it sounded like if Southerners wanted to bring slaves up to the North, there really wasn't much the North could do about it. You have to understand the states' rights argument's ridiculousness in the context of states' rights for who, and states' rights to do what, and which states' rights. And Buchanan and Pierce and many of the Jacksonian Democrats seem to just think that the North was going to acquiesce to the South. And the South was, and maybe they also thought the South, once it was given what it wanted in terms of, hey, we're never going to, we'll promise you can keep slavery, that's all the South wanted, not understanding the fundamental concept of the Southern Manifest Destiny mindset was we need to keep expanding. It was always about expanding to the West, and then it was talking about expanding to Cuba. There was not a point where the Southern Democratic Jacksonian mindset was going to go, yeah, we got enough, we're good, we can stop here, and we believe you guys will leave us alone, and we're just going to occupy this area and have this little slave area, and you guys can do what you want. It was never going to be you guys can do what you want. It was never about states' rights, unless you want to argue it was the Southern states' rights to expand and impose their belief systems and their economic systems and the concept of slavery and white supremacy upon others. That was the right they wanted to expand, the rights of the Southern states toward the Northern states. Buchanan never understood that. And again, that's why I also didn't give Pierce a pass. Pierce didn't understand it. The Dred Scott decision meant that the Civil War was now inevitable. There was no path forward for anyone who wanted to have a legal discussion, who maybe wanted to de-escalate this through slowly phasing out slavery. It fundamentally it made it a legal doctrine that slavery was going to continue on. It's not a shock that John Brown's raid comes in the years after. At that point, we can no longer negotiate. If you're a northern abolitionist, there's no longer negotiation. The Supreme Court has made clear we're not negotiating, and that's when it became functionally war. So growth, when half of the country secedes under your administration, you don't get a lot of points toward growth. Finances. Sometimes people forget Buchanan was not just bad in one area, he was bad in many areas. There was an economic panic, the Panic of 1857, so an economic recession caused by a banking run and panic. In 1857, his response was to do basically nothing. I believe the exact quote was he was advocated for reform, not relief. He had a banking run, led to a 2-year recession. He did nothing to fix it. He did nothing to ameliorate it. He just did nothing. And believe that was the right course of action. Do nothing on economics seems to be a recurring theme for Jacksonians, and it will be something we see again with other administrations later. Again, he gets very low marks on finances. International politics, I mean, he didn't get involved in the Second Opium War, I guess, is something you can say to his benefit. He was a better Secretary of State than he was as a president. But in looking at the international matters, I don't know if it was because there was so much going on domestically that international politics just wasn't really something focused on. I'm not going to say he was bad at the international politics of the day. I didn't see anything that made me go gasp, but it also might just be I was looking at comparing it to the other five. So I'm going to give him a fairly neutral rating on international politics. War and security. Before we even get to the Civil War, let's put aside the fact that half of the country seceded from the Union during his administration and that he left the office on the precipice of the Civil War. Let's put that to the side. Even if we didn't have that giving him an incredibly low score for war and security, on his watch, he sent federal troops to Utah to remove Brigham Young. You can argue whether that was necessary, justified, all sorts of other things. He sent federal troops and got into an more or less open war with the state of Utah during his presidency. I have a whole video on that if you want to know the history of the formation of the state of Utah. It's a very complicated thing, so I'm not going to go deep into details, but he was unable to negotiate a way out of that until it had already become bloody and things had already gone quite sideways. Eventually, it didn't turn into something, I guess, as bad as it could have been, but the fact that it became a war on his watch is still just a black mark on his name that I would have put against him in terms of war and security, even if, again, elephant in the room, he left the country on the verge of civil war. Better or worse? Again, putting aside the elephant in the room that would already put him at the very bottom of leaving it better or worse, because it's very hard to leave a country worse than on the verge of civil war. He also had an incredibly corrupt administration full of bribery, um, just so many scandals that had came up during his administration. Again, and that's all putting aside the fact that he left the country on the brink of civil war. There is a reason many people call James Buchanan the worst president of the United States. I think when we read most historian lists, he's either at the bottom or near the bottom. It is very fair to put him there. He did a horrible job with his presidency in nearly every aspect, and I am going to obviously put him currently 15th and expect him to remain at the bottom slot for some time to come.